During the first 6 months of war in the Pacific, the Japanese conquered hundreds of thousands of miles of territory in Eastern Asia and Oceania. By mid-1942, they reached the Solomon Islands, which just a few years earlier writers described as the most remote place on Earth, where one could escape completely from the cares of the world. To the Japanese, Guadalcanal was a most desirable piece of land. Using that island as a base, they might well succeed in severing the lifeline from the U.S. to Australia. But in June 1942, to Japanese troops who occupied Guadalcanal, it was just another island conquest in their southward advance. The forces of Imperial Japan had been overwhelmingly successful in their ambitious campaigns during that first half year of all-out war. In Washington, the government's concern over Japan's domination of Eastern Asia and the Western Pacific was voiced by its last ambassador to the Japanese Empire, Joseph Grew.
I know by long experience of the overweening ambition of that Japanese military machine, of its great strength and power, of the intensiveness of its training over long years for any kind of fighting, of its fanatical determination. I know what it aims to do to these United States. I have had ample evidence of the work of those barbarous hordes, first bombing, burning, bayoneting, and then, when masters, raping, torturing. Our country is today in peril. Believe me, for I know. It must and shall not happen here, and yet it will with mathematical certainty happen here if we lose this war.
The combined chiefs of staff in Washington were prompted by the enemy threat to the vital U.S. to Australia lifeline to schedule a quick counterblow designed to stop the aggressors short in the South Pacific. In late July 1942, the 1st Marine Division embarked from its advanced training area in New Zealand. The division, under the command of Major General Alexander van der Grift, was hurriedly loaded aboard the transports on the attack force. The assault force moved north in deep secrecy. For the first few days, the seas were placid, but this condition was not to prevail for long. In view of the limited size of the naval force, it was decided to make as much use as possible of the weather as cover. In late July, observers forecast a cold front sweeping northeastward, passing across the northeast corner of Australia on August 4th, and moving toward Guadalcanal at a speed of 300 miles a day. Under cover of the bad weather, the assault force was able to move into enemy-controlled waters with little chance of detection by Japanese planes. Many of the men on board had never experienced any weather rougher than a squall in a mountain lake. And when the weather turned bad in the Pacific, that ocean seemed to be poorly named indeed. The assault on Guadalcanal was timed so that the naval force would make the last part of the trip under cover of the cold front, to a point just off the island target. The plan worked perfectly. During the night of August 6th, the cold front passed over the Guadalcanal area, and on D-Day morning, August 7th, the seas were calm. Soon after dawn, naval guns announced the beginning of America's first offensive action in World War II. Under the direction of officers who were experts in newly developed techniques of amphibious warfare, the assault waves of the 1st Marine Division headed for the beach. On shore, the enemy was ominously quiet. Promptly at 8 a.m. on that August morning in 1942, American Marines set foot on the first piece of Japanese-held territory, Tulagi. Across the channel on Guadalcanal, the main landing was not opposed. At any moment, the commanders knew the enemy might launch a counterattack, which would surely be made before the assault forces had a chance to get well established. No contact was made with the enemy until the second day, when the Japanese opened up on the American position. While other Marine battalions were fighting on Tulagi and several other islands off Guadalcanal, the campaign for the key Japanese stronghold in the southern Solomons gathered momentum. Enemy soldiers, adept at jungle fighting, were difficult targets for Marine riflemen. This was the first experience for American fighting men in a new kind of warfare. By nightfall of the second day, August 8th, the Marines' beachhead extended less than a mile inland and 4 miles along the shore. But at least they had a foothold. As the campaign on Guadalcanal continued, the Marines grew accustomed to fighting in jungle country, where it was necessary to battle the enemy on his own terms, in his own style. It took a little longer to get accustomed to some of the routine features of life on a tropical island. And this pre-war South Sea paradise was inclined to be just a bit damp. The first half of the 6-month-long struggle for Guadalcanal was fought during what was called the dry season. The men often wondered what the wet season would be like. On August 9th, the first of a series of unprecedented naval battles for control of the waters surrounding Guadalcanal was joined off Savo Island. A fast Japanese fleet of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer raced down the slot, the passage through the central Solomons, bent on destroying U.S. ships at Guadalcanal. The Japanese fleet managed to sneak into the Savo Island waters unchallenged by the American warships. The Battle of Savo Island turned into an overwhelming Japanese victory. Augmenting the naval successes, the enemy made effective use of his air superiority in the Solomons. Operating from bases in the northern and central Solomons, from Bougainville and nearby islands, Japanese planes dominated the skies over the area. Daily they came down the slot to bomb American forces on Guadalcanal, where the issue was still in doubt. The Japanese pilots who made the run to Guadalcanal were among the best in the Japanese Air Force. The enemy was throwing his most thoroughly trained personnel into the frantic effort to stop the American counteroffensive. On Guadalcanal, the American fighting men could almost set their watches by the regular visits of the enemy planes. Japanese pilots had things pretty much their own way. The main target, which all the enemy bombers concentrated on, was the airstrip, for which the American Marines had fought so hard. Henderson Field, which had been seized on the second day and never lost, was quickly repaired after each bombing. The few American planes on the island took a steady beating. From forward bases on American-held islands, U.S. fighter pilots took off to battle the enemy in the Solomon skies. As the Guadalcanal campaign stretched from weeks into months, the fight for the air over the Solomons began to change complexion. At Japanese bases in the northern Solomons, gunners were pressed into action for the defense of their installations with increasing frequency. The enemy was now forced to reconcile himself to the sight of American planes over what he had come to regard as his territory. U.S. bombers began to plaster Jap air bases in the northern Solomons regularly. These attacks on enemy positions in the northern Solomons helped lessen Japanese pressure on Guadalcanal. Airstrikes by land-based U.S. bombers, mostly Marine, against enemy fields grew increasingly important as the Solomons campaign passed into its 3rd month. On Guadalcanal, Marine commanders were helped materially by information supplied by friendly natives. Officers like Raider Colonel Evans Carlson received hearty cooperation from most of the Melanesian inhabitants. During October, U.S. forces fought off counterblows by a stubbornly resisting enemy. The Japanese battled fanatically, but their counterattack failed. The campaign began to look a little brighter to the Marines and their commandant, General Thomas Holcomb.
The Battle of Guadalcanal is now shaping up in our favor. It's a fight of man against man in the jungle, and man for man, American Marines and soldiers are superior warriors. It is not yet won, but we possess the balance of power and intend to hold this advantage.
The U.S. foothold was now firmly established. After months of bitter fighting, there were decorations for uncommon valor to be made. To men like Marine Raider Colonel Merritt Edson for his heroic stand at Bloody Ridge. In late October, the Japanese made another strong bid to turn the tide of battle in the Solomons by sending a fast fleet into action. Japanese naval units were to search out and destroy American warships operating in Solomon's waters. Japanese pilots were to play the key role in the planned annihilation of the American fleet. If the planes achieved their objectives, the Japanese were confident they could regain complete control of Guadalcanal. After 2 days and nights of preliminary sparring, the Battle of Santa Cruz was finally begun in earnest on October 26th. This naval engagement followed the new pattern of Pacific naval warfare, with the planes functioning as the principal attack weapon, and the ships zigzagging to keep out of the enemy plane's sights. The battle raged without let-up throughout the morning. Carriers on both sides were under almost constant air attack. A flat top like the Hornet was a prime target for Japanese pilots. Between 9 and 10 a.m., enemy planes scored several hits on the Hornet, and the big carrier was seriously crippled. Badly damaged, the Hornet lay dead in the water. At about 3:30 p.m., all hands were ordered to abandon ship. Santa Cruz was a tactical victory for the enemy. On Guadalcanal, U.S. Army troops were arriving in considerable numbers to relieve the original assault units. Their assignment was to hold at all costs the territory which had been seized by the invading force of Marines, and to resist all enemy attempts to retake that invaluable patch of ground. Equally important was the Marine Engineers' assignment, to build Henderson Field into a sizable air base, capable of accommodating bombers in some quantity. The newly arrived units brought with them the materiel so necessary in the transformation of the waterlogged airstrip into a bomber base. From Henderson Field, large attack groups would carry American bombs north to be deposited on Japanese positions. In a very few weeks, Henderson Field had the look of an efficient, well-equipped airbase, ready to handle any problem which its new complement of planes might present. On December 9th, 4 months after the invasion of the island, the command of the U.S. fighting forces on Guadalcanal passed from the Marine Corps to the Army. The same day, elements of the 1st Marine Division began leaving the island. The weary assault troops were headed for a rear area for rest and relaxation. Most Japanese soldiers refused to be taken prisoner, but there were a few. Those who were taken spoke freely about their units, and many carried military orders, diaries, and other valuable sources of information. Japanese money was a popular souvenir until the novelty wore off. The 1st Marine Division could have set itself up in a tidy little business on Tokyo's Ginza if it hadn't had other matters to occupy it. In January, Guadalcanal was visited by the Navy's brass. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox had made the long trip from Washington to see for himself how well the sailors and Marines were carrying the fight to the enemy. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, and Admiral Bull Halsey were also in the party. Captured enemy equipment proved particularly fascinating to Halsey. The tour of inspection of the area seized in America's first offensive impressed the visitors with the capabilities of the fighting men under their command. Guadalcanal was termed officially secure on February 9, 1943. From an area of only a few dozen square miles, American soldiers and Marines held control of the island. The U.S. position was never again seriously threatened, but the price paid for that small corner of an island in the South Pacific was high. More than 3,000 Americans had died fighting the enemy at Guadalcanal, so that the U.S. could seize the offensive and move forward in the long chain of bloody campaigns toward final victory. The heroes of Guadalcanal were fighting men of various races and creeds. Thanks to their supreme sacrifice, the U.S. had stopped the enemy's sweep of aggression. U.S. forces now held a commanding area in the strategic southern Solomons. From Guadalcanal, the U.S. was in excellent position to follow up its first victory on the road to Tokyo. But although the U.S. had won an important position in the Solomons, the enemy still controlled the major part of the island chain. In February 1943, American soldiers and Marines invaded the Russell Islands. There was no opposition. The U.S. gained another foothold in its drive up the Solomons ladder. In late June, Marine raiders and Army troops invaded two key islands in the New Georgia group in the Central Solomons. On June 30th, the Army's 172nd Regimental Combat Team headed for shore in the invasion of Rendova Island. The landing was a pushover. Meanwhile, on New Georgia Island itself, the 4th Marine Raiders went ashore and quickly overcame the initial enemy resistance. Landings were also made at several other points on New Georgia, by the 1st Marine Raiders and by GIs of the 37th and 43rd Divisions. All the landings in the New Georgia group were quickly achieved and beachheads secured. The terrain of the islands in the New Georgia group was worse, if possible, than that at Guadalcanal. In the drive toward Munda Airfield, the troops were concerned not only with the enemy, but with the swamps and impenetrable jungle which slowed the American offensive down. This first taste of combat for some of the GIs in the New Georgia operation was hardly what they'd been expecting. Artillery was brought into position for the shelling of Munda. Corduroy roads were built to bridge the mud and facilitate transport wherever possible. But most of the artillery had to be dragged into position through the everlasting mud. The concentrated U.S. attack in the fight for Munda Airfield included units of all branches of America's armed forces. Allied bombers supplemented the naval bombardment of Japanese positions surrounding the strongly defended airstrip on New Georgia. For 5 weeks, the embattled Munda area held out against everything that U.S. forces could pour on it. But slowly the Japanese area shrank. The defenders often had to be dealt with individually by the Americans. Finally, the Japanese grip on the area was broken. Nipponese troops who had defended Munda so fanatically met the same end as their brothers in arms on Guadalcanal. American troops went to work quickly in cleaning out the area of any last-ditch defenders. But the Japanese defense force had been virtually annihilated. U.S. bombers had done a thorough job on Munda, as American ground units discovered when they surveyed the airfield. The reconstruction of Munda Airfield was most urgent to the American forces. Although the strip was less than 150 miles from strong enemy bases in the northern Solomons, Munda was not heavily attacked by Japanese air units. The job of reconstruction moved ahead with incredible speed. While the work was being rushed, planes were taking off from the widened strip. Meanwhile, at sea, another major battle was joined at Kula Gulf during the first week of July. This time, the Japanese fleet was attempting to annihilate U.S. invasion forces in the Central Solomons. But as the battle in Kula Gulf began, it was the American ships which surprised the Japanese for a change. Although the cruiser Helena was lost, the U.S. sank 2 Japanese destroyers in the 4-hour-long engagement. The American force gained a great tactical advantage in the battle by performing a classic naval maneuver, crossing the enemy's T. This time-honored trick put the enemy in the unfavorable position of finding suddenly that only his lead ships could fire, and only forward. The American fleet, on the other hand, could fire simultaneous broadsides against the enemy's ships. But the first battle of the Kula Gulf was not decisive. Exactly 1 week later, before dawn, the fleets joined battle again in the same waters. In the second battle of the Kula Gulf, the U.S. fleet suffered the loss of 1 destroyer. But in addition, 2 of her fast cruisers were seriously damaged. The Honolulu had taken several torpedoes in her side. The St. Louis was also hit by a Jap fish in her bow at the height of the battle. The enemy fleets had inflicted heavy damage in several major naval battles in the waters off Guadalcanal between August 1942 and February 1943. This series of bitterly fought engagements in the seas of the South Pacific marked a new era in the naval history of the world. The final tabulation of the naval battles off Guadalcanal indicated almost a draw. But Japan in particular could not afford the losses sustained by its navy in the Solomons. On August 15th, 1943, American soldiers and Marines invaded Vella La Vella, still farther up the Solomons ladder. U.S. forces now controlled the Solomons area, almost to the shores of Bougainville. To relieve the original assault force, which had landed virtually without opposition, 2 New Zealand combat teams were sent to occupy Vella La Vella and stave off any Japanese attempts to wipe out the Allied beachhead. Some of the Kiwis in this unit had served with distinction in the quite different but grueling war in the Middle East. This was their first active appearance in the Pacific War. But in the months ahead, they and their countrymen were to play an important role in small, unpublicized campaigns in which enemy pockets of considerable size were involved. The Kiwis were tough fighting men, ideal for the war against Japan. The American position in the Solomons had improved tremendously by virtue of the increased range of its air power. Until mid-1943, U.S. planes in the Solomons were limited to targets within range of Henderson Field. But with Munda in American hands, U.S. bombers could hit Japanese positions anywhere in the Solomons. From Munda, U.S. planes soon took off daily in a series of coordinated attacks on key Japanese bases in the South Pacific. In addition to raids against the most important enemy fields in the northern Solomons, U.S. planes were preparing to drop thousands of tons of bombs on major bases like Rabaul, the enemy's South Pacific fortress. In October 1943, the first large flights took off on missions to Rabaul, 400 miles away. From Munda airstrip, a much more formidable base than it had once been, U.S. planes headed north to neutralize Rabaul. As the missions to Rabaul continued, U.S. planes dropped the staggering total of nearly 2,000 tons of bombs on the Japanese bastion in 1 month. By December, the skies over the Solomons area were undeniably American. But in the northern Pacific, the war bore little resemblance to the war that was fought in the equatorial latitudes. In the Aleutians, the troops were also indulging in island hopping, but the islands were of quite a different type. Lying on the great circle route between North America and Japan, the Aleutians were bleak, isolated outposts, but only 1,500 miles from the heart of the enemy's home islands,